we're gonna do a repeat. We had Eli scheduled to guest for 3 weeks and he canceled 3 times. So we won't invite Eli back, I don't think. But thankfully Hayden has agreed to step up again and answer all your your pressing M&A questions. I think you set out an agenda in the group chat, right, Hayden?
Yeah, well, I actually want to start running these calls at least a couple times a month and rotating between different stages of acquisition. And today I was thinking we'd talk about post-close, so becoming management run, growth, etc., which I think is important no matter what stage you're at. It's part of diligence, etc. So same as last time. Anyone has any questions, please, just leave a question. Until then, I'm probably going to open with a question that was left in the Slack channel that we can sort of double click on a little bit more from Paul Callahan. And he asked, he said, underway with post-LOI diligence, I'd love to hear from those that have worn the path before me. Any advice on things you would do differently, kicking yourself for not digging in at the time, hindsight on priorities, etc. Which is a great question. And I thought about it, and I have like 7 or 8 different things here. I know Noah is also in the call. Hey, Noah. Might not be here. But he also left an answer, and I might ask him if he's willing to dig in a little bit more in his answer as well. So my first answer was around WIP and backlog. So WIP, for those that aren't aware, is work in progress. So for any business that has a construction component, which is, I'd say, probably 80 to 90% of the businesses that most people are looking at, there is this concept of backlog. And backlog is actually, this terminology is kind of, it's not used the same everywhere. The way it should work is that a WIP, or work in progress, is a job that has already started, right? Meaning, someone has left a deposit and work is beginning. In backlog should contain only signed contracts, so signed LOIs on jobs that will start but haven't received any money yet, right? And so many people will treat backlog as, it's not 100%, right? Specifically things could get delayed, more so than, things not starting. A company could go bankrupt, permits could not get, approved. So just those 2 things are important to distinguish, backlog and WIP. Some people just say backlog and mean both. That's not uncommon. Some people say WIP and mean both. That's not uncommon. It's not correct. So one of the things that I look at on the WIP, and by the way, not all of these companies will have a WIP, and I think technically it might be state dependent, but you don't need a WIP unless you're of a certain size. You don't, like, from an accounting perspective, you're not required to have a WIP until you have 25 million, I believe, a year in annual revenue. But basically what you want to look, so you'll see a project, you'll see how much the billings on the project are, you'll see a % complete, and you'll see sort of an overbuild versus underbuild amount, and you'll see an estimated cost.
Recorded.
One of the things I want to look at is, first of all, how big is the WIP in terms of outstanding billings. So a strong WIP is typically, let's say, in outstanding billings is typically about 8+ months of the previous year's revenue. And ideally, it's 8+ months of the previous year's gross profit. And ideally, the WIP is tracking gross profit, so you can see how gross profit is trending. Is that clear to everyone? Just how I'll take a break every moment here if something isn't clear.
Okay. And feel free to raise your hands if you have questions or if something isn't clear.
So
is there any way to verify that work in progress or backlog, or they just say something and they, I've seen people sending a little Excel table, or company or broker sending a little Excel table. It can be true or it can be not true. Half of it can be true, half of it can be not true. I don't know how to assess it.
yeah, 100% you can verify it. The piece that's harder to verify is the percent completion, and the overbillings, underbillings. That's much harder to verify, but you can verify with each item. So for backlog, you'd ask to see a copy of the signed contract. You don't see a copy of the contract, it doesn't exist. If it's just, oh, that was, a verbal agreement, it doesn't exist, right? And I wouldn't include it. For WIP, you would actually have money entering the account. So it would be part of the QOE if you're paying for a QOE to make sure that, to analyze the WIP and make sure everything is stated, or everything is actually as it's stated. So that should be part of the QOE. The only piece is there may be things like, and this might happen towards the ends of years as well, like the ends of calendar years, where there may be like greater amounts of deposits being prepaid. That can happen as companies want to get like their budget used for, closing out a calendar year. And that's a little bit harder to verify.
I see. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. So yeah, ideally you want at least, let's say, 8 months of outstanding billings on the WIP. When you are forecasting with a construction company, right, you're effectively, most of these, you need to look at the cycle of a project, right? So most of the time, a lot of these projects, especially larger projects, and it depends on the type of project, right? Like, is this a shell or a tilt-up construction versus a renovation? But they may take months to start, right? So the forecast, you're basically looking at your WIP, the outstanding billings currently on your WIP, a percentage of your backlog. Now that percentage will be what percentage historically of backlog has turned into WIP, right? Which you can look into as part of your diligence. And then also what percentage of backlog historically actually turns into revenue within, let's say, 3 months, 6 months, however you want to look at it, right? Because not all of it may start and actually turn into billable revenue in your first year of operation. And then finally, you're looking at the estimation process and the bidding process that the company has. How many bids do they put out? What's their bid acceptance rate? You can segment this, and I would segment this as much as you can, like based on customer, because most construction companies that are good will have usually like a handful of customers where they are the builder of choice, and they're going to have a much higher acceptance rate for those companies. And we'll dig into this particular piece a lot more because it's very important. So yeah, understanding your bid success rates across segment will give you an idea. Those 3 things combined are basically your forecast, for at least the next calendar year, right? After that, a lot of the stuff operationally that you're doing today or you do post-acquisition will have an impact, but it's likely in the construction company not going to have an impact for at least 6 months, and most of it potentially up to a year. Does that make sense? So yeah, in terms of like regrets, one of the earlier companies we did at Snowball completely misrepresented their backlog. That was a problem. That turned into a lawsuit. So that was fun. That's probably, I think since then I've probably overcorrected on the diligence process here. And I haven't made that mistake again, but I have seen others make a similar mistake. Before I go further into some of the other, regrets I've had, I want to dig a little bit deeper on this piece, and specifically the opportunity side of it, I guess, and talk a little bit about how how construction works in a good company, right? And so I mentioned before that with a lot of construction companies, whether it's a GC or whether it's a subcontractor, you become the vendor of choice for a select group of customers. And there is a seller archetype that I have encountered many, many times now, which is basically the founder, the owner operator, their only goal is to take care of their customers and take care of their employees, right? Outside of that, they have no other real goals. And they treat their customers, specifically their most loyal customers, they give them the best service possible, but they also actually give them the cheapest prices because they're afraid of losing them. And almost every single company I've bought in the construction space has been like this to an extent. And there's a huge opportunity in just increasing prices with that base. So one company I was working with last year, they gave priority service. Literally, they would drop anything if there was any minor detail that came up, to a handful of customers, and they would do tiny little projects. They would often not charge for change orders. They'd often not bill if some other subcontractor like went out and broke a bunch of pipes or something like that, and they had to fix it. So overall, the gross margin was lower. And then they'd also bill lower. And they did this all because they felt that the power relationship was on the side of, in this case, the GC. When in actual fact, the power relationship is significantly more equally balanced, if not more in the favor of the sub here, right? Because they're providing superior service, they're not a pain in the ass, they're not slowing down the entire process, they're not, increasing opportunity costs for the GC. And we ended up increasing prices across the board for those customers. This is probably the 4th or 5th time I've done this out of probably 4 or 5 companies, and had zero issue. The other thing that they did was they overly inflated prices for new customers, right? And so their bid success rate was like 100%, close to 100% for a current, customer of choice, and like under 10% for new customers. And what we ended up doing was turning that around, right? Because what that ends up becoming over time is just increased customer concentration. So if you ever want to go and resell this company, and you buy the company and it's got already 30%, customer concentration, and you keep on doing this, it's eventually going to have like 50 or 60% concentration. So basically what you have to do in these types of situations is you have to understand that, a decent size, like this is not a great market in terms of ethics. And so a decent percentage of GCs will not pay on time and you will not want to work with again, right? A meaningful percentage, maybe a quarter. But you kind of have to bid a whole bunch of shit and experience that for yourself, or you are just going to make the customer's concentration worse in your business. One of the biggest issues you'll have when you encounter this is convincing your leadership team to increase prices, because they've usually gotten this mindset from their founder, from the original founder, and are extremely worried that they'll lose the customer. My approach has always been a little bit of a Socratic approach, where I'll ask them, hey, you're the experts here. How are you guys in terms of quality, right? In your specific space, are you middle of the pack, top of the pack? Often they'll say, yeah, we're the best, right? Or we're among the best. Then you ask them, okay, well, how are you in terms of pricing, right? Are you the highest priced? Are you the second highest priced? No, they're middle of the pack. And you ask, how do you pay your employees? Middle of the pack. That to me has worked over and over in terms of convincing them that they have to increase prices. Understanding that if they're the best, they need to charge like the best. And if they charge like the best, they can pay like the best. So that's just a little story there. Any questions related to that?
I have a question, Hayden.
Yep.
So you're talking about like changes to kind of your customers and your relationship with your customers, and then comparing that to like making changes internally and kind of changes that only impact the employees maybe. Do you have recommendation or guidance on how early on you would advise doing either or both? So can one happen quicker than the other? And I know it depends, but ballpark, at what point do you start making changes like that?
I would make pricing changes immediately, but you need to get buy-in first, right? So it kind of, it works. You need trust, and then buy-in, and then commitment. And with trust, you can usually get a certain level of trust within the first 30 days of ownership by just being there, working hard, caring personally, right? Ideally, you'll also find, to get a little bit of buy-in, you'll be able to, make some very small, quick wins. So when you do one-on-ones with employees, you'll see a bunch of trends around, kind of like a collective shame that some of the employees might have due to how the business has been run. All right. It could be something to do with the office. It could be the fact that, the printer hasn't worked for 3 years. Right. And just fixing that immediately is a nice way to get buy-in for change. So I wouldn't do it I wouldn't do it in the first 30 days. Once you have some level of buy-in, however, I would do it, but I'd have them make the change, right? So, and they'll have the relationships with the customers anyway. So that's why I said it's not that I came into a business and I said I increased the prices. No, I came into the business and I did some analysis, suggested we increase prices, and then spent probably in the first case, with an HVAC business, I spent almost 3 months convincing them to do the change. We ended up increasing the price by 50% and then 50% again, another 2 months later, and had 0 complaints. The first one was, I wondered when you were going to do that. That was the response. Does that answer your question?
Yep.
Yeah.
What if the seller handles the relationships, like you said previously, and then you come in and try to raise prices?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what we did.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the answer was, I wondered when this was coming, because every other sub is doing this, right? It's just in these 2 cases that I'm thinking of, they hadn't increased their prices since, I think that business we bought January 2021, they hadn't increased their prices since 2019. And so that's actually a great diligence note, is with each individual customer, did they increase prices? Have they changed their bid sheet? When was the last time they changed their bid sheet? Oh, we should talk about bid sheets as well, because they're always a mess.
And I mean, you could still use the excuse of being in an inflationary environment, and if they haven't raised prices, then there's just pent up necessity for that.
100%. And like, another sort of regret, or something I wish I had done sooner or prioritized, and in fact, since learning this, I've made it part of the QE process, was understanding unit economics by segment, as early as possible in the process. So now when we do a deal, we know it before we actually buy the deal. So that, as an example, what is your gross margin for construction versus service, or residential construction versus commercial construction, or even custom homes versus 2-story track homes, or custom homes versus single-story track homes. So one business that we bought, we found that their average margin was negative on single track homes. And they didn't even have, they were so cheap, obviously, the builder didn't even have them bidding anything. They just had a price book for this certain class of home, right? And they had a negative 2% margin. So I was like, hey, if we lose this work, fine. We'll technically be a little bit more profitable. And that's not uncommon, to find that there's a segment that is significantly less profitable than anyone thought, or anyone the company knows. And that when you bring it to them, they have no idea.
Mark asked, after post-close, how many years should we have in carryover cost in case things go wrong?
So, I mean, there's always a net working capital question here, and how much money should you have in the bank account? I would suggest at least 3 to 6 months of OpEx, SG&A, probably 6 months is safer. Yeah, so I'd say 6 months OpEx is healthy. You know, having access to growth capital, I think, is quite important. Because you never know what's gonna happen. I think Noah's response in the Slack channel too is like, you know, you could have a couple employees quit and you have to go hire and train new people. You could have growth costs that you want to invest in. A few of those things could happen. You could have, you know, AR that never gets paid, right? You could have a big job fall off, and some of those, sometimes, you know, you flip a coin enough times and it'll fall heads like 3 times in a row, and that's when you kind of need access to that capital. So I always recommend that you have at least 2 sources of lines of credit, in addition to whatever working capital is left within the business. And my approach is to be quite aggressive on the working capital peg, and settle ideally. So if you open with an aggressive ask and then settle on something slightly less aggressive, I'd ideally like whatever that delta is to be accessible in the form of a seller line of credit where you'll pay them interest, because they're getting a bunch of cash out of this. You know, they're probably going to invest it in the market somehow anyway, and so this is not a terrible ask. And then that gives you, you know, one extra source. Amex has a good line of credit program, especially if you do a stock purchase. You can basically be approved in hours. And then you can work with, obviously, your SBA loan to get a separate line of credit, and you can work with whatever your merchant bank is at the business.
That answered my question. It was perfect, guys. I'm like on 2 channels at the same time. Sorry about that. I'm dialed in and it's connected to the internet, so my apologies.
No worries, man.
A couple other, so I'll move away from sort of the WIP backlog stuff, unless people have any more questions about that. Couple other regrets. Seller retention. I've done seller retention probably like 3 times in my life across maybe 30, 40 deals. Only 4 times actually. Twice in sort of the digital space, twice in sort of this home service space. It's never worked. And it's never worked usually because it's just hard to have 2 chefs. It's hard to have, like, leadership. People are used to looking at the old leader. It's very difficult to have the new leader also there. So my advice with seller retention is don't do it. Because I mean, at least that's my advice, because I've never made it work. Maybe you guys can figure it out better than me, though. Another thing I'd say, and I think this is mentioned everywhere in the training over and over again, but I just want to double down on it, is your number 1 most important relationship is the seller. And it's your most important relationship going through diligence, but also going through closing and integration. Everything is easier when you have a good relationship with the seller. Everything is incredibly difficult if you have a sour relationship with the seller. So I would say choose your battles here. You know, if the seller has an emotional attachment to something in the business, respect that. You know, if they want to keep their truck, fine, they keep their truck. I'm not going to fight over that. And then when you come in, just, you know, have a little bit of respect, right? Don't suddenly come in and entirely, like, you know, throw out all the shit in their office, which we've had people do in the past. Just come in and like, no, I don't like their decor. Yeah, so respect that relationship. Another regret, I've never had this, but I've certainly seen a lot of AEs have this, is extremely fast transitions. So where the seller transitions out of the business in like a month or less. And I've had people in some instances, you know, say, hey, this is my transition date ahead of time, you know, and it doesn't adjust. And so when a deal inevitably gets delayed by like 2 months, your seller is now transitioning out like 1 week after you buy the business. That's happened once. Um, I've mentioned this before, but I think like the ideal here is to shoot for like 6 months transition where it's split into 2 phases. Let's say 3 months full-time involvement and then 3 months support paid for by hour. And then you have the ability to accelerate phase 1 to phase 2, which you'll almost always do whenever you want.
What about when there is a management in place?
I would say same thing.
Okay.
Yeah. I would, yeah, I take management in place with a grain of salt. Just because it's rare that the seller is not actually still pretty much full-time involved in the company, at least providing some form of leadership. And it's rare that the seller doesn't have a whole bunch of processes that really only exist in their head and to the outside world looks like an art form, and you need that time to be able to get it out of their head and put it into systems.
Not to have you bounce around a little bit, but you did talk about bid sheets
Mm-hmm.
and changing bid sheets. If you could elaborate more on that.
Yep. So bidding is an extremely important part. It's probably the most important part, the estimation department of a construction business. What you'll often find, so always ask to look at the bid sheet as part of your due diligence. Don't comment on it or don't like disparage it and don't say, why is it like this? Why is it like that? I mean, you can ask questions, but then probably in the back end, you should have your own version or redo that bid sheet. You'll often find that people, so like a standard bid sheet might have ideally just sort of time and materials and then some target gross profit margin, right? That's basically the idea behind it. And your time should be based on a labor burden rate, right? And that labor burden rate will often increase your average hourly wage by about, say, 40%. Depending on how good your benefits are and your, vacation pay and stuff, it could be higher, it could be 60%. What I found with other people's bid sheets is they'll often do something like, I'll give you an example. So one business, their bid sheet for commercial bidding, they bid per crew day. And their crew had 2-people crews. And they bid something like, I don't know, I think it was $600 per crew day. And that was based on, the seller's understanding of their burden rate, right? Then the bid sheet, and I've seen this a few times, kind of obfuscated profit. So they took their materials. So first of all, there was some profit in that daily rate, right? Secondly, they marked up materials and they basically said they had a margin of 10%, but they also marked up tax. And then they put in some other like random charge to essentially come to what should be like about a 20% gross margin, right? And overall, it kind of equaled out to like a 25% gross margin. But for whatever reason, and I think the reason was they didn't want other employees in the business to know how much money they were making. They basically obfuscated it so that it seemed like there was something more like a 10% margin on the business. And I think this is due to, I've never met, and maybe it's this space, like, I guess I come from more of a technology space where everything's a bit more transparent, but I've never met an owner who is like, yeah, I share my numbers with my team. That same business the owner's focus was entirely on commercial. They had hired a guy to do their residential, the custom homes. And the first day on site, as the first thing we do is go through the estimation process. I finished with the founder on the commercial side, went into the office with a guy on the residential side, and I find out that they're charging that same sort of 2-man crew at $600, they're charging something like 700 for a 3-man crew, or 650 for a 3-man crew. Like, and this is now that space where, you know, the commercial is getting 25% gross margins and residential is getting like 5% gross margins. And I just pointed that out. It's like, why are you charging 650 for a 3-man crew if you're charging 600 for a 2-man crew? And the seller like walked in. He's like, you guys have 3-man crews? Just had no idea. It had been run like this for like 8 months. And again, that's not uncommon. This is a business with, you know, 45 employees.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. So is this something that you would definitely do post LOI due diligence? Or, I mean, I imagine they'd probably be close to the chest pre LOI due diligence.
Yeah, this is all post LOI.
Yeah.
Like I said, like that segmented gross profit analysis is usually part of the QOE now.
Got it. Thank you.
In terms of companies that have, well, actually, let me back up a bit because we were talking about bidding and estimating. There are, I'd say, 3 easy ways to improve revenue in construction. One is do more jobs with your, you know, best customers. That's the easiest by far, right? What you're actually buying when you buy a construction company is you're buying, you know, a really strong, ideally a strong brand and talent pool, but you're buying relationships with customers that trust you. And so, I mean, obviously you can increase prices we already mentioned that. But do more work for those good customers. And often, you know, a lot of companies will not travel out of, you know, their main city of operation. They'll get a lot of bids from their customers saying, hey, you're in San Antonio, I need you to do this job in Austin, or even I need you to do this job in Houston, right? And really, really low hanging fruit is to say, sure, I'll do the job in Houston, but I'm going to pay each of my guys a per diem bonus, and I'm going to pay for a hotel, and I'm going to pay for meals, and I'm going to mark all of that up 100% and put that into my quote. And lo and behold, you'll almost always get accepted. And the guys will be super happy because, you know, they get this nice, you know, maybe a $75 per diem bonus. They get to stay in a hotel for a few days. You know, people are usually happy about that. Number 2 is you can go and bid more work, right? And so there are bid portals out there if you want to bid more work from other customers. They tend to be, the people who ask for bids on bid portals tend to be one of 2 camps. I would say it's like 90% people shopping for the lowest possible bid, and 10% people super desperate because their main subs aren't available. So when you work with a bid portal, ideally you want to be finding the bids for that 10%, but often you have to bid a lot of different things to get it, right? So your bid success rate in a bid portal might be like a 10% success rate. And then thirdly, it's business development, which happens in one of 2 ways. Either you just do the business development yourself, or people on your team do it, you know, and get out there, or you hire people from other companies and you pay them, you know, a percentage of gross profit on any clients they bring in, right? And so the latter is a very, very common way for people to expand. Is they headhunt from their competitors and then give them, let's say, you know, 5 to 10% of gross profit for the first 2 years of clients that they bring in. I personally don't try to grow construction. I do only the first, so I only increase prices and then do more work for the good customers. And then I entirely focus on growing out service. Unless it's a business where service isn't a huge component, right? But mainly we work with plumbing and HVAC, where service is a big part of the business. And I can talk at length about that if anyone has questions.
So you wouldn't be like necessarily building a platform GC and like adding more lines of business, for example?
GC is a little different. So I think GC, my approach with GC, so we're buying a GC right now, and it does about 4 million EBITDA, 40 million top line. I'm taking exactly what I just said. You know, we're in one city. Our goal is to take the same customers and go to another city. Our goal is to also hire estimators from other companies to bring on some work. But ultimately, we want to buy that GC because we have access to about 1,500 subs underneath them that we could buy. And so it's a bit more of a acquisition, growth through acquisition play for us. GCs they scale really well. And if they're part of I think there's a place for them as part of a portfolio because your billings per employee is probably, $1.5 million on a decent GC. And that scales way better than a plumbing company. Also the risk, GCs, basically all the risk goes onto the sub, right? If a GC doesn't get paid, they're really just out the cost of their, supers and their project managers, but they're not at the cost of any materials, right? That all comes on the sub. And ultimately, if a lien is placed on the owner or developer, it's usually placed by the sub, not by the GC. Yeah, but I guess I'm mainly talking here about subcontractors.
Okay, that helps.
Well, I can talk about building out service if people are interested, or I just don't know how many people here are looking at businesses in that that have a service option. So I don't want to waste your time if you're not looking at like plumbing or HVAC businesses. All right, well, I'll talk about it. So when you forecast, like I said, when you forecast construction, you're basically looking at WIP, backlog, bidding, right? And, pricing. When you forecast service, the first thing I look at is latent demand. So if the business already has a service division, a lot of these businesses don't have, they're not up to date. They don't have like an up-to-date website. They're not really doing any digital marketing. And they're often leaning on the local brand that they've had in their community for, decades. There's often a certain amount of latent demand that exists, which you can tell based on availability of plumbers, right? So how much backlog there is when someone actually asks for something. Do they have to wait days? And I've often found that a business that has a service division that's existed for decades will typically have room to almost double the number of techs they have just based on the latent demand that exists. And like I said, the way to test for that is to see how long it takes for you to get to calls. So as an example, we bought a business that had 3 service plumbers. It didn't have a website. It had existed in the community for like 70 years. The owner's approach to service, and I quote, is service is a necessary evil, which is the opposite approach of like younger owners in this space that come, especially in private equity, where they look at like service as a way to basically plant seeds that you can harvest in another 10 years for replacement furnaces and air conditioners. When we bought the business, actually all 3 service techs moved into leadership roles. We had to backfill for them and then had to hire more service techs. We ended up having, I think, 7 service techs and not spending $1 on digital marketing, and they kept going. Just based on latent demand in their area. So that's the first thing I'll look at is what latent demand exists. Next thing, obviously, it's digital marketing. So this is typically on like GSL, GLS, or the Google Local Services. Google Guaranteed is quite good as well, and has been for the last couple of years. I typically don't have great results with Facebook, but basically you're paying per click. You're looking at a return on ad spend of usually about 5 to 10x depending on the industry, and depending on the market. And that's extremely scalable. And so ideally, you want to get the demand first, so you keep your techs busy. You want to build up the backlog, and then you want to go and hire techs. And hiring a tech in this case is getting a truck, outfitting a truck, hiring a tech, and that can often take 3 months, right, to do all of those things. And so you really have to be on top of sort of your demand planning to do this efficiently. But typically for HVAC, your revenue per truck will be around 400, 450, okay, at a 55% gross margin. Plumbing, your revenue per truck will range. I'd say there's like 3 different types of plumbing service calls. So you have a service call that's kind of your standard, fix a leak, unclog a drain, where you have more junior guys on it. That's probably like 250K revenue per truck. But with some sales training, you can get that up. And then you have boiler work and like tankless water heat, basically gas work. That's probably like 3 to 350 depending on the market. And then you have underground work, which is, you need really experienced plumbers to do that. And you're looking at like probably 450 to 600 per truck. So, sorry, I saw a couple questions come up there.
Sorry, I'm on mute. Yeah, Kelly asked, could you talk a bit about to what to think about in niche type businesses? She's looking at a wholesaler that provides product to HVAC installers. It's kind of a distributor, but they will also do large commercial projects themselves.
Okay, yeah. I mean, it sounds like 2 businesses in one, which isn't uncommon. I would treat it that way. I guess the question is how much of it is a distributor and how much of it is actual construction.
Mostly distributor.
Okay.
And they're in geothermal, which is kind of it's an expensive product.
Mm-hmm.
But potentially growing, but it's really hard to, I'm finding, size the market and get information on that.
The size of the geothermal market.
Yeah, and the potential growth.
It's residential?
Yes, and some commercial, like primarily residential with like maybe 2 to 3 big projects a year that are commercial.
Do they do any non-geothermal?
No, strictly geothermal.
Is there a lot of like credits or rebates in the state for geothermal?
There are in specific municipalities, yes. And there's recently a new federal tax credit for consumers. So that's something that can be marketed.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, so the credit rebate thing is potentially a risk, potentially an opportunity if something new just happened and they haven't, trailing years haven't seen that, the effect of that. Geothermals, it's very high ticket. It's typically high profit margin. It's, I mean, obviously it depends on the region, on how effective it is. I would look at, so as a distributor, what are they distributing into whom?
The furnaces themselves, and they have one one manufacturer, that they are one of two licensed distributors in the state. So it's a single state, which is kind of a concern for me too. Like, so their thing is they work with, they have a warehouse and they have product on hand, so that if an HVAC installer wants to install geothermal, they can get the equipment and install it like the next day, like they could with any other heating and cooling supplies. And typically geothermal, anyone else you would have to order from a factory. It would take two weeks to get the equipment. So that's kind of their claim to fame and how they've been able to penetrate the market with HVAC providers. So they're marketing to the municipalities that have credits, and they're marketing to HVAC providers directly, and they're also marketing to end consumers. So people who are interested in green energy, people who are interested in sort of the high-end product for new construction for their new house, and then bringing those leads back into their business and then farming them out to HVAC installers that they know will follow through and do a good job.
Interesting. Is there a certification or training component at all to the business?
None is required, but one of the ways that they have convinced HVAC providers is the owner or the seller will go out and train them directly. So, they understand the product and they understand the process.
Yeah, I think that's an opportunity in the business for sure. I have a buddy who did something similar in Canada, and we're also looking at buying a plumbing company that's in a similar space. So they do backflow. So they're a backflow distributor. They do actual backflow, and we've actually already bought their book of work. And then they do a backflow training school. So it's pretty common, and when you go niche, very niche. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a cool business. I think going niche is often better. It's you have more of a moat. The question is, I would look at that. You really need to look, and it's very state and industry specific to know whether the sort of credit or rebate or situation is a plus or a minus to the acquisition today.
Right. Yeah, and there's just not as much to compare with. There are not as many players in the space. So, I mean, there are plenty, but it's difficult to get information about them. I'm just concerned about like the opportunity. So if I were to grow the business and we've got whatever their penetration is in the state and the potential geothermal customers, so we've got that market. But then what's the overall demand? Is that increasing? And then if we saturate the state, then where do we go from there? Do we have to buy other providers in other states? Do we have to get licensed in other states? So I'm just, trying to get a handle on what the growth trajectory could look like and it was realistic,
Well, yeah, and that's interesting if you think of the business as only doing geothermal and only ever doing geothermal, but what if it does other forms of HVAC?
Yeah.
Like, is there any reason not to do that?
No. Not that I can think of.
You can be an option that.
Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was gonna say you can be an option that always presents the geothermal option, but that doesn't mean that you can't do, standard HVAC. In which case your addressable market is just like any other business. I think there's an interesting opportunity in the sense that you have another user, which is the actual HVAC technicians of other businesses. And so the question is like, how can you make that an advantage long-term in growth, whether that's, whether it's a way to just hire people overall and hire techs, which is one of the hardest jobs, or whether it's something involving training and certification as a line of business. I think that's an interesting avenue to explore, at least.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Mintus said, and Tomas, I'll get to your question in a sec, but Mintus said, what if it isn't a niche example? I found a specialty window and door company I am considering. They use a few suppliers, but don't manufacture themselves. Really good SDE growth. The owner attributes it to hiring salespeople. Thoughts on growth strategies?
Yeah, so a lot of these windows and door companies, you kind of have three business lines, right? You have a manufacturing business line, an installation business line, and then a distribution business line. So this obviously doesn't have the manufacturing side. The only issue with not having the manufacturing side is lead times can be a lot higher, especially for anything custom, which a lot of the stuff ends up being custom. So your sales conversion rates drop a little bit versus someone who does manufacture. It's ultimately though, like if you're a pure distribution company, you're ultimately just a marketing channel, a marketing and sales channel. And so I would look at that like any other sort of marketing and sales channel. How can you use digital marketing to get people to a showroom? And how can you do that better than your competition? Yeah, so I look at that from three different business lines. If these guys just do distribution, then yeah, this is the sales and marketing business. And if you're not really confident in your own sales and marketing skill set, or have resources there, it may not be the best fit.
Got it. No, super helpful. No, they do have a timeline issue for sure. That's something that they've mentioned, so you're spot on there. Sales and marketing is my strength, so that's why I'm still interested. But like based off of, obviously this is like a nugget of information. Is this a business you would go in the direction? Because that's why I'm hesitating on it. It has really healthy numbers, size, SD, location, everything is like perfect. But I'm worried about the fact that it's like, I'm not saying it's a reseller, but it kind of is.
Oh, I mean, it definitely is a reseller. That's not necessarily a bad thing. It's your diligence is it's just all going to be around marketing and sales, and especially marketing, because that marketing, if there's a lot of platform risk in that marketing, like are they getting a lot of stuff from like Google SEO? Are they getting stuff from most of their leads from a specific platform? I look at that as I look at that platform risk as so I'll actually individually model out some pretty serious risks associated with that. So for example, I'd say there's a decent chance if that your CPA on a given platform may increase by 50%. So I would model that out in a down case scenario. Likewise, if you're getting a lot of like SEO traffic, I'd say there's a decent chance that you get that traffic drops to zero any given year of operation. So ultimately, in this type of business, you want to move all external traffic into own traffic, whether that's email or social media, ideally email. And all because of that, the multiple should be lower, right?
Right.
Than a business that does manufacturing. Does it do installation?
I don't think they do. I'm still early I'm meeting with the owners on Monday, but from what I can read so far, no. I think they just do delivery of them. Funny enough, they don't seem to do like any marketing. Like their website is very lackluster. They're very, very heavy on sales.
Interesting. Okay.
So yeah, I have a lot of pieces to put together because I'm trying to figure out like, how are you all getting customers? It's not your website. And so far the answer has been sales, but I'm meeting the owner on Monday.
Okay. Yeah. Is it all retail or commercial?
Some commercial and some retail as well. And some mostly residential projects as well. It's in the Austin area. There's a lot of homes. It's a lot of modern like decor kind of orders that they're doing.
Yeah, I wouldn't discount it. I wouldn't say like this is something you should stop looking at. I would say that a business that does just this trades at a lower multiple than a business that does manufacturing and install as well. So it's probably, assuming it's in sort of the range we're typically looking at, let's say around 1 million SD or a little below, it's probably sub 3x, unless it's super, super
Interesting.
high growth. Yeah.
So that's exactly what I was thinking, but it's on sale for
Mhm.
5x, which
Yeah,
is
that sounds
interesting.
like, yeah, I mean, that just sounds like an unreasonable multiple to me.
Helpful. Okay, no, that's
Mhm.
very helpful to hear you say that as well, because was thinking to myself, I'm like, I'm sure they would find it insulting for me to offer what I would think for
Yep.
that.
I
Helpful.
definitely learn about the sales strategy though. Let me know if you think it's cool.
Yes, no, I'll
Yeah.
report back. I'm gonna meet with them on
Mhm.
Monday about it.
Um, Mark raised his hand, but before we get to him, Tomas had a question because we're a little over time. But how can you assess demand on a small service area? Mystery calling?
Assess demand.
Yeah.
Like assess the size of the serviceable market, or assess existing demand that happens with their customers.
Like you were talking about like how much wait time there is for a business to
Mhm.
deliver something, and I just associated that with the demand on the market.
Yeah, so okay, so not market share, but just how do I assess like latent demand,
Latent demand.
demand that we're currently unable to fulfill. Yeah, I would so I would look at they're likely not using something like Service Titan. If they're using an ERP like Service Titan or Jarbor or Service Fusion, then you'll actually be able to see stats on booking rates. And your biggest thing that inhibits booking rates is availability. And so typically you'll want to see like 85% plus booking rates means you actually have decent availability. If they don't actively track in an ERP, I would simply ask them to record it as part of diligence.
Oh, okay. I was thinking of looking at the whole local markets, not just that particular company.
So if you want to look at market share, what kind of company is it?
Just in general.
In
Talking
general,
in
okay.
general.
So like market share, like, so, and this might be helpful for Kelly's question too. So let's say we have an HVAC company and I want to understand the market share that this target company owns, right? I would look at the number of households, and I would look at basically assume that each household on average will have a replacement of their system every 12 to 15 years. If you want to be conservative, say 15 years, right? Okay, so if there's 100,000 households, and they're going to be replaced every 15 years, that means there would be about 6,667 replacements a year, right? 20%, 10% market share would then be 667. And so that's kind of your way to understand market share. And my rule for market share is typically I want 20% market share to represent a 3x growth in the EBITDA of the business. If it's less than that, I don't want the business. Because like then a home run is meaningless.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Did I answer your question?
Partially. I was thinking more of when I see descriptions of companies, I see a lot of them saying that, oh, there is just so much demand in this area that we can't handle it. And I'm wondering, one, is it true? Is there a way to verify that statement? And two, maybe they have a lot of demand because they are unable to fulfill it with their own team, either because of inefficiency or they just don't have a big enough team for it, that would be a good thing. But I'm sorry, I'm very skeptical with everything that I read.
Yeah, no, and you should be.
And
So
unfortunately, in most cases, my skepticism has grounds, but I try to shift away from this mindset because I'll never be able to do a deal if I don't switch this mindset to how can I make this work.
yeah, and I would be skeptical of anyone saying that this has great growth, et cetera. I mean, I would say that, the brief example I gave you is a good idea of understanding approximate market share. You
Mhm.
can go further So I'm buying a roofing business right now, and this is market with extreme hail damage where the average roof span is like 7 years. And I kind of did this estimate, and then my CFO was like, okay, well, that's nice. Let me actually go get data. And so he went out and he talked to the supply house of the business we're buying, and basically asked them what market share looks like, because they know exactly how many tiles are sold. They know how much market share they own, and they know how that changes over time and seasonality, and what was the last year like, or compared to 3 years ago, which is huge for anything that's sort of weather related. So that would be another way. Just talk to the supply house, right? Ask them, because they know, they've got the data.
Okay, thank you. That's a good point there.
Sweet. Any last thoughts, Hayden, or any last minute short questions from the group?
I do have a question.
As long as it's short, Mark. No, I'm kidding.
Oh.
No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
Well, it won't be. No. Anyway, I have a how do you feel about like partnerships, Hayden? Because I have a mentor that has like a adhesives company, and it's pulling more than 150 million a year in revenue. They got clients such as Nestle, Starbucks, Clorox, Procter and Gamble, and he wants to do a partnership with me, and they're in the process of doing a growth expansion of hiring over 1,000 employees. How do you feel about that type of partnership?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it depends on the terms of the partnership, but I think that's always a good option. It's a good way to get your feet wet too, assuming it doesn't have a huge capital outlay on your end. So Daniel, some of you guys might remember Daniel Elizondo. He actually, before he bought his first business, he just kind of cold called people with HVAC master licenses in Houston, where he lives, and he actually managed to partner with a refrigeration company to build a service company. It never went anywhere because neither of them wanted to put any money into paid advertising, but it was still, I think, a really good exercise for him.
That's sweet because he has all the national minority certifications. He's been in business for 50 years and you know doing like real aggressive expansion right now. Like I said, they're getting a warehouse. The ink hasn't dried on a deal yet, but they're planning on hiring 1,000 employees more than like the 500 that he already has, and has trucks and all different types of clientele and everything. This set. So
Cool.
I checked out part of the company, and it's basically going over the financials and things of that nature. But some of it I seen on the they had UCC liens out, probably on some of the equipment this year. I seen like 2 UCC liens on there. So I just need to know how to do like more research on it and get more information because I've already met his CFO and things of that nature. So
Cool.
All right, everybody. We're a little over time, but thanks again, Hayden, for jumping on the call and answering all our questions.
Yep. No, my pleasure. Yeah, I'll probably do another one of these. I'm gonna do them, I think, staged office hours, maybe every couple of weeks, and talking about different stages for people.
Yeah, and if anybody has any questions outside of these calls, like feel free to reach out in the Slack. We're always there to answer questions, and it helps us prepare ideas for the next call as well.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
All
Have a
right.
good weekend.
Take care, everyone.
Stu, thanks.
Guys.